Tonight, we travel along a thread that has wound its way through thousands of years of human history. It is a story of shimmering fabric, of caravans crossing vast deserts, and of secrets so carefully guarded they shape the fate of empires. This is the story of silk. From its humble beginnings in the mulberry groves of ancient China, to the Great Silk Road that connected distant civilizations, to the arrival of European merchants and the birth of global trade. Finally, to the modern world, where silk remains a symbol of both beauty and wonder. But first, let us begin at the very start. According to legend, it began with a cup of tea. Nearly 5,000 years ago, in ancient China, an empress named Lai Zhu sat beneath a mulberry tree. As the story goes, a small cocoon fell into her tea. She watched as the hot water softened the threads, and with delicate fingers, she pulled the shining filament from the cocoon. That single strand stretched on and on, longer than she could ever imagine. What she had discovered was the beginning of silk. From that moment, sericulture, the raising of silkworms, was born. The worms fed on mulberry leaves, spun their delicate cocoons, and were carefully tended by generations of farmers. In the earliest of times, silk was reserved only for emperors, nobles, and sacred ceremonies. The shimmering fabric was unlike anything else in the world. It became a treasure of status, a fabric of the divine. And for centuries, China held it secretly, tightly. To reveal it to foreigners was even forbidden. Smuggling silkworms or their eggs was even punishable by death. For the longest of time, the world knew only the mysterious fabric, never the creatures or the processes that made it. However, over time, silk became more than just a fabric. It became a bridge of cultures. By the 2nd century BCE, during the Han Dynasty, China began to send caravans westward. From the great city of Chang'an, today known as Xianan, traders loaded camels with rolls of silk and began their long journey through mountains, deserts, and steppes. These routes would come to be known as the colloquial Silk Road. The journey was perilous. Traders crossed the Talmankan Desert, where shifting sands swallowed entire caravans. They climbed the icy passes of the Pamir Mountains. And yet, they persisted, because the demand for silk was immense. In the West, in Persia, India, and the Roman Empire, silk was unlike anything else. Roman writers marveled at the fabric, so light and translucent it seemed spun from sunlight. Along the way, silk was exchanged for horses, spices, precious stones, glassware, and metals. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar became oases of culture and trade, their markets overflowing with goods and ideas. But the Silk Road was more than just commerce. It carried religions, philosophies, languages, and inventions. Buddhism spread from India into China. Later, Islam would travel along it eastward. Techniques in astronomy, medicine, and art were shared across continents. Silk was the thread, but what it wove was a tapestry of cultures bringing together East and West. In the 13th century, the Silk Road reached its golden age. The Mongol Empire, stretching from the Pacific all the way to Eastern Europe, brought a kind of order to the vast lands in between. This period is sometimes called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Caravans traveled more safely, roads were maintained, and merchants moved with fewer fears of bandits or war. It was during this time that a young Venetian, Marco Polo, journeyed eastward, eventually reaching the court of Kublai Khan. His tales of glittering cities, strange customs, and endless riches would later inspire generations of explorers back in Europe. Silk, however, remained a symbol of power. Emperors used it as diplomatic gifts. Monks and travelers carried it as offerings. For many, silk was as valuable as gold. By the late Middle Ages, the Silk Road was no longer only a path of caravans and camels. Europe, hungry for the luxuries of the East, began to look for new ways to reach a land route to Asia. At first, Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa grew wealthy as middlemen. Their merchants brokered deals with traders from the eastern Mediterranean, carrying silks, spices, and perfumes into Europe. But European monarchs and merchants longed for more direct access. They wanted to bypass the many middle layers and control the riches of trade for themselves. The Portuguese were the first to try. In the 15th century, Prince Henry the Navigator sponsored voyages along the coast of Africa, searching for a sea route to Asia. Eventually, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India in 1498. This moment changed world history. Soon afterwards, Portuguese ships carried silks, spices, and porcelain directly to Europe from Asian ports. They established fortified outposts in Goa, Malacca, and Macau, creating a maritime empire that tied Europe to the east. Not long after, the Spanish followed. Christopher Columbus, sailing west in search of Asia, stumbled upon the Americas. But the Spanish crown soon sent ships across the Pacific as well. From Manila in the Philippines, Spanish galleons carried Asian silk to the Americas, and then to Europe. These Manila galleons connected China, Mexico, and Spain in one of the first truly global trade networks. Then came the Dutch. In the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, became one of the most powerful trading enterprises in history. With fleets of sturdy ships and heavily armed crews, they seized control of key ports and islands across the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. From their base in Batavia, in today's Jakarta, the Dutch directed trade in silks, spices, and tea, funneling Asian luxuries back to Amsterdam. The British soon joined in as well. The English East India Company, chartered in 1600, competed fiercely with the Dutch and the Portuguese. Over time, the British gained control of ports in India and expanded their influence eastward. By the 18th century, silk was flowing into London, fueling both fashion and industry. British weavers in places like Spitalfields used imported silk to create gowns, waistcoats, and embroidery that became the height of elegance. Other European powers tried their hand as well. The French developed their own silk centers in Lyon, producing fabric that rivaled the Italian and Chinese weavers. But across these centuries, the pattern was the same. Europe's maritime empires used ships, cannons, and colonies to dominate the flow of silk and other Asian goods. For the first time, the fabric once kept secret within China had become part of a global economy, stretching from mulberry groves in Asia to the courts of Europe to even the colonies of the New World. The Silk Road had shifted from land to sea, and silk itself had become a thread that tied together empires on every continent. As European powers spread their reach across the globe, silk was never far from their ambitions. The Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and British all sought not only to buy silk, but also to cultivate it for themselves in their far-flung colonies. If they could raise silkworms abroad, they would no longer rely on Chinese or Indian merchants, but could rather spin wealth themselves directly from their own territories. In India, the British East India Company turned Bengal into one of the largest silk-producing regions outside of China. Bengali silk was both fine and delicate, and by the 18th century, it was flooding into London. English factories produced it into gowns and embroidery, blending Asian threads with European fashion. For the company itself, silk exports became just one of the many ways it enriched itself, often at the expense of local weavers who were forced into strict trade controls. The French, too, encouraged silk weaving in their colonies, while in the New World, experiments began in places like Mexico, the Caribbean, and even the English colonies of North America. For a time, Virginia and Georgia tried to raise silkworms on mulberry trees. Colonists dutifully tended their cocoons, sending small shipments back across the Atlantic. But the industry never took deep root. The climate, the scale, and the labor all favored tobacco and cotton instead. Elsewhere, however, colonial officials dreamed of using silk to reshape local economies. In the Philippines, Spanish rulers promoted weaving as part of the Manila galleon trade, tying communities into the global exchange that stretched from China to Mexico to Spain. Not all efforts succeeded, but the pattern was clear. Silk was so desirable that empires tried again and again to grow it, weave it, and profit. Whether in Bengal, Manila, or the plantations of Georgia, silk became another strand in the vast wave of colonial empires. By the 18th century, silk was no longer the guarded secret of China. It had become a global fabric, raised in Asia, shipped through colonies, processed in Europe, and worn in courts and cities across the globe. But the world was changing. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution transformed the textile industry. Cotton, woven by machine, became cheap and abundant. Wool, too, could be processed in factories at scales that silk could not match. Silk, delicate and labor-intensive, could not compete with these industrial fabrics. Its production remained costly, its weaving slower, it had reached its limit. Yet silk still held an allure that no other fabric could replace. Even as cotton filled warehouses and ships, silk remained the choice of the wealthy, the ceremonial, the refined. In Paris and London, silk dresses still glittered in candlelight at grand balls. In Asia, silk remained deeply tied to tradition, religion, and cultural identity. The 20th century brought even more challenges. Scientists developed artificial silk, first rayon, then nylon, and polyester. These materials were strong, cheap, and could be made in vast quantities. For many uses, synthetics took silk's place. And yet, silk survived. To this day, it is treasured for its softness, its sheen, its breathability, and its natural beauty. In China and India, silk weaving continues on both massive industrial and small artisanal scales. Across the world, silk scarves, ties, and gowns remain symbols of elegance. Silk even found its way into science and medicine, used in surgical sutures, parachutes, and even in modern research, exploring spider silk as a model for advanced materials. From emperor's robes to laboratory fibers, silk has endured. And so, the story of silk stretches across millennia. From a single cocoon falling into a teacup, to caravans winding through deserts under starlight, to the sails of great ships catching the wind across oceans, to the machines of factories and the scientists of today. Silk has been the thread that tied empires together, a fabric that traveled farther, endured longer, and inspired more wonder than almost any other. As you close your eyes, imagine the soft shimmer of silk in candlelight, and the countless hands that have raised, woven, and carried it through history. Sleep well, and may your dreams be as rich and as timeless as silk. Tomorrow night, another story from history.